The kettle on the stove let out a high, thin shriek, a sound that cut through the perpetual twilight of the Brinegate morning. Leonard preferred the noise to the silence. Silence in Lumen Reach was never truly empty. It was heavy, filled with the groaning of the floating islands, rubbing against the atmospheric tides, and the distant starving hum of the Starwell far below the cloud layer. Leonard lifted the kettle, with a hand wrapped in a rag that smelled of grease and ozone. He poured the boiling water into a chipped ceramic mug, watching the dark leaves swirl and bleed into the liquid. It was a root tea bitter enough to make a lesser man gag, but Leonard drank it for the shock. It was a reminder that his tongue still worked, that his blood still pumped, and that he was against all odds, still alive to complain about the taste. He sat at his workbench, a slab of scarred metal, dominated by the tools of his trade torsion wrenches, laser files, and pots of conductive paste. But his attention was on none of these. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the object that defined his mornings more than the sunrise ever could. It was a key. Or rather, the remains of one. It was fractured down the middle, the teeth worn smooth, the metal cold and dead. Leonard took a small whetstone from the drawer. With slow, rhythmic movements, he began to grind the edge of the broken key against the stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a useless action. The key would never open anything again. The door it belonged to had been vaporized 10 years ago during the final days of the Ember campaigns, along with the bunker behind it and everyone inside. Everyone except Leonard. Grind it until the hands stopped shaking, he muttered to himself. It was his mantra. Some days, it took 5 minutes. Some days, like today, the tremor in his left hand was a stubborn thing, a ghost of a nerve ending, screaming about a war that had supposedly ended. He worked for 20 minutes until the tremor subsided into a dull ache. He slipped the key back into his pocket, downed the dregs of the bitter tea, and stood up. Outside his workshop, Brinegate was waking up, though. Waking was a generous term. The harbor town was a cluster of rusted metal shacks and stone dwellings clinging to the underside of a massive floating geode. Above them, the clouds of the salt void swirled in lazy, toxic patterns. The only reason the town existed was the sun relic. Suspended in the center of the market square, the relic was a sphere of captive fusion fire, no larger than a human head, encased in a cage of gold and scripture. It was the heartbeat of the island. Without it, the encroaching cold of the void would turn their blood to ice in an hour. But today, the light was wrong. Leonard stepped out onto the metal grating of the walkway, pulling his coat collar up against the biting wind. He looked toward the square. The relic was usually a steady golden pulse. Today, it stuttered. It flickered like a dying bulb, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to jump and snatch at the passers-by. Leonard. The voice was sharp, cutting through the wind. Leonard did not turn immediately. He knew the voice. It belonged to Warden Brisa, the woman who ran the docks, and by extension the town. He turned slowly. Brisa was marching toward him, her heavy boots clanking on the grate. She looked tired. Everyone looked tired these days, but Brisa wore her exhaustion like a heavy coat she refused to take off. "I am retired," Leonard said before she could speak. "If it is a boat engine, ask old Thomas. If it is a lock, bring it here. If it involves the council or the synod, I am dead." Brisa stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. "It is not a boat, and you are not dead, unfortunately for both of us. We need you to go up." She pointed a gloved finger upward past the rusted roofs, past the mining rigs toward the jagged spire of rock that hung suspended by massive chains above the town. Station X. Leonard followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "No. The relic is dying, Leonard," Brisa said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The connection is fraying. The tech priests say something is draining the ambient flow from the relay point. That relay point is Station X." "Station X is a tomb," Leonard said, turning back to his door. "It has been sealed since the Ember campaigns. You know the law. What the war sealed, let no hand open." I do not care about the law when the temperature is dropping, Brisa snapped. She stepped closer, lowering her voice further. The seal is old Leonard. It is cracking. The council thinks the leak is coming from the integrity dampeners. We do not need a priest to pray at it. We need a mechanic to weld the damn thing shut before the relic goes dark and we all freeze. Leonard looked at his hands. The oil stains were deep in the fingerprints. I patch hulls. I fix simple tumblers. I do not touch war-era seals. That is synod work. The synod is 3 days away, Brisa said grimly, and the relic has maybe 12 hours of stable output left. You are the only one in Brinegate who knows how those old military suppression fields work. I saw your service file, Leonard, before you retired from dying for others. Leonard flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but Brisa saw it. She softened her tone just a fraction. I am not asking you to open it. I am asking you to reinforce the lock. Just keep the door shut, Leonard, please. Leonard looked at the flickering light of the sun relic in the distance. He saw a mother hurrying her child across the square, wrapping a second scarf around the small face. The child was shivering. He hated that he was a good man. It would have been so much easier to be the bastard everyone thought he was. Double my rate, Leonard said, his voice flat. And I want a crate of real tea, not this root garbage. Brisa exhaled a puff of white steam in the cold air. Done. The ascent to Station X was a nightmare of wind and vertigo. The bucket lift groaned in protest as it winched Leonard up the side of the floating cliff face. Below him, Brinegate shrank to a collection of scattered sparks in the gray fog. Station X was not a space station in the modern sense. It was a relic of a different time, carved directly into a massive asteroid of starstone. It looked less like a military outpost and more like a monastery hanging over the abyss. Gothic arches jutted out from the rock, and gargoyles carved from meteor iron stared blindly into the void. It had been a way station for the Paladins during the war, a place where they stored things that were too dangerous to destroy and too terrible to use. When the war ended, they did not empty it. They just locked the door. The bucket lift slammed into the docking cradle with a bone-jarring thud. Leonard climbed out, adjusting the heavy tool bag on his shoulder. The air here was thin and tasted of ozone and static. He stood on the landing platform. Before him lay the Great Gate. It was a slab of obsidian 10 feet tall, covered in glowing circuit runes that pulsed with a faint, warning red light. This was the seal. It was a masterpiece of thaumaturgical engineering, a blend of high technology and old magic. Leonard approached it cautiously. He pulled a spectrum analyzer from his belt and scanned the surface. The readings were chaotic. The energy field was not just fluctuating, it was trembling, like a lid rattling on a boiling pot. All right, Leonard muttered to himself. Let us see where you are bleeding. He knelt at the base of the gate where the physical locking mechanism was fused with the energy barrier. He could see the problem immediately. The anchor bolts made of spectral steel had corroded. The salt air had eaten away at the physical housing, causing the energy loop to ground out. It was a simple fix, in theory. Weld the housing, reset the harmonic frequency, go home, Leonard recited. He put on his welding goggles and ignited the plasma torch. The blue flame hissed a comforting angry sound in the oppressive silence. He began to work his movements precise and economical. He melted fresh bonding agent into the cracks, sealing the physical breaches. The tremor in his hand threatened to return, but he forced it down, focusing on the heat, the light, the job. He was just a mechanic. This was just a broken machine. After an hour, the physical repairs were done. The red light of the runes stabilized. But the hum, the deep, resonant vibration of the gate, still felt wrong. It was off-tempo. Harmonics are drifting, Leonard whispered. He holstered the torch and pulled out a tuning fork, not a musical one, but a heavy rod of conductive silver, used for calibrating magical fields. He tapped the tuning fork against the obsidian. It rang with a pure high note. He pressed the fork against the central rune of the seal. The goal was to dampen the vibration to force the seal back into a static state of locked. But as the vibration traveled through his arm, Leonard felt something. It was not a mechanical feedback. It was a memory. For a second, he was not on Station X. He was back in the bunker 10 years ago. The air was filled with smoke. The sirens were screaming. He was holding the line, holding the door, trying to keep the darkness out. He remembered the rhythm of the suppression codes they used back then. It was a specific beat, a syncopated pulse designed to counteract enemy breaches. Thump, thump, pause, thump. His hand moved before his brain could stop it. It was pure muscle memory, a soldier's reflex triggered by stress and proximity to military tech. Instead of dampening the vibration to a flat line, Leonard tapped the seal in that old, wartime counter rhythm. Thump, thump, pause, thump. The moment his knuckles hit the stone for the final beat, he knew he had made a mistake. The red runes did not stabilize. They turned white, blinding, searing white. The hum of the gate stopped instantly. Silence slammed into the platform, absolute and terrifying. Then a sound. Click. It was the loudest sound Leonard had ever heard. It was the sound of a heavy deadbolt sliding back. It was the sound of a vacuum seal breaking. It was the sound of a mistake that could not be undone. The obsidian gates did not swing open. They simply dissolved. The stone turned into a mist of black shadow and drifted away, leaving the archway open. Leonard scrambled backward, dropping his tuning fork. It clattered loudly on the stone floor. He reached for the plasma torch, instinctively turning it into a weapon, though he knew a welder would do nothing against whatever had been locked inside a war-grade prison for a decade. Stupid, Leonard hissed at himself. Stupid, stupid old man. Darkness spilled out of the open archway. It was not empty darkness. It was cold, smelling of dried lavender, old blood, and library dust. Leonard held his breath. He waited for the monsters. He waited for the combat constructs, or the void demons, or the radiation ghouls. 3 figures stepped out of the shadow. They moved with a grace that made the air seem thick, like they were swimming through water rather than walking through oxygen. The first was tall, wearing a gown of tattered midnight velvet that looked like it belonged in a museum. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, silver-streaked bun. Her face was pale as bone, her expression one of utter, terrifying boredom. This was Margaret. The second was shorter, moving with a restless, predatory energy. Her dress was torn at the hem, revealing boots meant for riding, not walking. She had a sharp, angular face, and a mouth that seemed permanently curled at the corner, as if she had just heard a joke that was only funny because someone got hurt. This was Helen. The third trailed slightly behind. She was softer, her eyes wide and dark, taking in the sky, the clouds, the rusty bucket lift with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. She wore layers of lace that were gray, with age, looking like a wilting flower. This was Rose. They stopped 3 meters from Leonard. Leonard did not move. He gripped his plasma torch, his knuckles white. He knew what they were. The pallor. The predator's stillness. The way the light seemed to bend away from them. Vampiresses. But not the feral scavengers the Synod warned about in their sermons. These were different. Ancient. They carried the weight of an era Leonard had only read about in history books. Margaret looked down at Leonard. Her eyes were the color of steel. "You are loud," she said. Her voice was like a cello bow dragged across gravel, low, resonant, and dusty. "We could hear your heart hammering from the cryo-sleep chamber. It is very rude." Leonard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Helen stepped forward, sniffing the air. Her nose twitched. Then her eyes widened. She looked at Leonard, then at the blood on his knuckles. He had scraped them when he scrambled back. "Blood," Helen whispered. "Fresh. Living. Soldier's blood." Leonard tightened his grip on the torch. "Stay back." The command was weak. He knew it. To his shock, they did not lunge. They did not hiss. As one, the 3 women dropped to their knees. It was a fluid, synchronized motion, a gesture of profound courtly submission that looked utterly bizarre on the windy industrial platform. They bowed their heads, exposing the napes of their necks. "The seal breaker," Margaret intoned, her voice devoid of mockery. "The waker, the first breath," Leonard stared. He looked at the torch in his hand, then at the three lethal predators kneeling on the dirty floor. "What?" Rose looked up, breaking the formation. Her eyes were huge. "Are you the new warden?" "I am a locksmith," Leonard said, his voice cracking slightly. "Close enough," Helen muttered, keeping her head down but looking up through her lashes. "Listen, O great breaker of seals, we pledge our fangs to your service, etc., etc. Now can we stand up? My knees have been calcified for 60 years. "Silence, Helen," Margaret snapped, though she did not look up. "We must await the command," Leonard blinked. "The command." "You broke the seal," Margaret said patiently, as if explaining gravity to a toddler. "By the old laws of the Ember Covenant, he who breaks the seal assumes the debt of those within. You are our anchor. Give us the command." Leonard's mind raced. He thought of the protocol for hostile entities: engage, contain, destroy. But he had no weapons, and they were kneeling. "My command," Leonard stammered. He looked around wildly. The wind was picking up, howling through the open archway. It was freezing. "My command is—" Leonard lowered the torch. "Why is it so cold?" It wasn't a command. It was a complaint. Rose immediately stood up, dusting off her lace. "Exactly. That is what I was thinking. It is freezing. Do you have a coat or perhaps a very thick rug?" Margaret rose with dignity, looking disappointed. "That was not a command, but I will accept it as an observation of environmental hazard." She hugged her velvet-clad arms around herself, shivering elegantly. "This climate is unacceptable. It is cold in a way that lacks basic politeness." "I have a tarp in the lift," Leonard said, his brain struggling to catch up with reality. "A tarp," Helen said, standing up and dusting her knees. She looked at the rusted bucket lift with disdain. "We sleep for half a century, and we wake up to a locksmith with a tarp." The prophecy was vastly oversold. "Who are you people?" Leonard asked, finding his footing. "You are vampires." "Vampiresses if you value your throat," Helen corrected, flashing a smile. Leonard saw the fangs then. They were not monstrous tusks, but needle-sharp ivory elegance. "And we are not people. We are the wardens of Station X. Or we were until someone laid us off and locked the door." Margaret stepped forward, looming over Leonard. She was tall, very tall. "I am Margaret. The sharp one is Helen. The one staring at your ear is Rose." "Your ear has a pulse," Rose said softly, leaning in uncomfortably close. "It goes thump-thump." Leonard stepped back. "I am Leonard, and I think I made a mistake." "Clearly," Margaret said, looking at his boots. "But the seal is broken. The bond is formed. We smell your blood, Leonard the locksmith. It smells like iron and regret. It is acceptable." "We are going with you," Helen stated, walking toward the bucket lift. "No," Leonard said firmly. "No. You stay here. I fix the door. You go back inside." "The door is gone, genius," Helen called back, peering over the edge of the lift. "You vaporized it. Besides, if we stay here, we will starve. Or freeze. And I refuse to die of hypothermia. It is a peasant's death." Leonard looked at the empty archway. She was right. The seal wasn't just open. The energy matrix had dissipated. He couldn't fix this with a welder. He needed components he didn't have. And down below, he looked over the edge of the platform. Far below in Brinegate, the lights were changing. The warm, golden glow of the sun relic was being overtaken by harsh, white searchlights sweeping the harbor. And then the sound reached them. Bong, 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 the great bells of the Dawn Synod. They never rang. Not unless there was an invasion or a heresy. A voice, amplified by massive speakers, rolled across the cloud layer like thunder. It was not Warden Brisa. It was a voice Leonard had hoped never to hear again. "Attention, citizens of the Reach." The voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly cold. "The holy seal of Station X has been breached. The darkness has been invited back into our world." Leonard froze. "The Dawn Synod declares a state of purity. The port is locked. We demand the surrender of the Breaker. Surrender him before the sun rises, or the town will be purged of shadow." Leonard stood on the freezing platform, the wind whipping his coat. He looked at the three women. Margaret was listening to the announcement with a look of intense distaste. "The Dawn Synod," she spat. "Do they still exist like a fungus that refuses to be scrubbed away?" "They want you," Rose whispered, looking at Leonard with wide, fearful eyes. "They called you the Breaker." Leonard looked at his hands. The tremor was back. He had gone up here to fix a lock. He had gone up here to earn a crate of tea and keep his head down. Instead, he had unleashed 3 ancient vampires and brought the wrath of the Inquisition down on his home. "Well," Leonard said, his voice hollow, "I suppose you cannot stay here." Helen grinned. It was a terrifying expression. Road trip. Leonard walked to the lift. He felt heavy. He felt like the soldier he used to be, the one who knew that once the first shot is fired, the only way out is through. "Get in," Leonard said. "And for the love of the stars, cover your heads. If anyone sees your faces, they will burn the lift down with us inside." Margaret nodded, ripping a length of dusty tapestry from the wall as she passed. She draped it over herself like a queen donning a coronation robe. "Lead on, locksmith," she said. "The night is young and we are very, very hungry." Leonard ushered them into the cramping bucket lift. As the gears engaged and they began the jerky descent into the fog, Leonard closed his eyes. He really, really hated his life. The descent was agonizingly slow. The bucket lift swayed in the crosswind's metal, screeching against metal. Inside the confined space, the presence of the 3 women was overwhelming. They didn't breathe, or at least they didn't need to breathe often, which made the air feel unnaturally still. "You are staring," Leonard said to Rose, who was huddled in the corner under a piece of gray canvas, her eyes fixed on his neck. "I am studying," Rose corrected gently. "Your pulse is elevated. 120 beats per minute. You are afraid." "I am sensible," Leonard grunted, keeping his hand on the emergency brake lever. "The Synod does not make idle threats. If they catch us, they will stake you and hang me." "Stake us!" Helen laughed, a sharp barking sound. She was sitting on the floor of the lift, wrapping her boots in rags she had found in Leonard's tool bag. "With what wood silver?" "It is all superstition. You cannot kill what is already dead with a pointed stick. You just annoy it." "They have sun lances," Leonard said. The laughter in the lift died instantly. Even Margaret, who was standing imperiously by the mesh window, looking out at the passing clouds, stiffened. "Suntech," Margaret murmured. "So they kept the weapon technology but lost the history. How typical." "What do you mean?" Leonard asked. "Nothing," Margaret said, turning back to him. Her face was shadowed by the heavy tapestry, but her voice was sharp. "Listen to me, Leonard. We are too old. That is what your records likely call us. Do you know why?" "Because you are old," Leonard guessed. "Because we are older than the Synod," Margaret said. "We remember when the sun relics were not gods, but batteries. And we remember who built them." She leaned forward. The smell of dried lavender and ancient dust filled Leonard's nose. "We are not monsters, locksmith. We are the backup system, and you just turned us back on." The lift jolted as it hit a turbulence pocket. Leonard steadied himself. "I did not turn anything on," Leonard said. "I broke a lock, that is all." "Accidents are rarely accidental when it comes to Starstone," Rose said dreamily. "The stone sings. You sang back. That is why the door opened. You knew the song." Leonard gripped the rail. I do not sing. Your blood does, Helen said. She had finished wrapping her boots and was now inspecting Leonard's tool belt. She pulled out a wrench and weighed it in her hand. Heavy. Good balance. Can I keep this? No, Leonard said, snatching it back. Stingy, Helen pouted. They were nearing the cloud layer. Below them, Brinegate was visible now, a grid of lights and shadows. The searchlights were sweeping back and forth, cutting through the gloom. The bells were still tolling, a mournful rhythmic pounding that echoed in Leonard's chest. He had a plan. A bad one, but a plan. Listen, Leonard said. My workshop is near the lower drainage pipes. We can get in through the maintenance hatch. But you have to be quiet. No talking. No threatening to eat people. And absolutely no bowing. I make no promises about the eating, Helen said. I haven't had a meal since the Second Era. Helen, Margaret warned. Fine, Helen sighed. I will snack on a rat if I must, but I expect high-quality dining later. We will be silent, Rose promised. She reached out and, with a hesitation that was almost shy, touched Leonard's sleeve. Thank you, for not leaving us in the cold. Leonard looked at her. Her hand was pale, her fingers long and delicate. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, not fear, but a heavy, confused responsibility. I am not saving you, Leonard said gruffly. I am just cleaning up my mess. The lift hit the lower docking cradle with a clang. They had arrived. Leonard peered through the mesh. The dock was empty for now, but he could hear the heavy boots of Synod guards patrolling the upper levels. Move, Leonard hissed. He unlatched the gate. The three vampiresses flowed out of the lift like liquid shadow. Leonard followed, locking the gate behind him. He led them toward the shadows of the shipping containers, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was a locksmith. He was a mechanic. He was a retired soldier who just wanted a quiet life. But as he looked at the three impossible figures moving silently ahead of him, protected by nothing but his bad decisions and a few rags, Leonard knew the quiet life was gone. He touched the broken key in his pocket. He didn't need to grind it today. His hands were perfectly steady, because for the first time in 10 years, Leonard had a mission. This way, he whispered, and led the darkness home. The salt tunnels beneath Brinegate were less of a passageway, and more of an open wound in the rock encrusted with decades of saline drip and the crystallized sweat of the island. The air down here was thick enough to chew tasting of brine and rust. Leonard moved through the gloom with the practiced stoicism of a man who had spent the last 10 years trying to be invisible. He held a lantern that burned with a low, chemical green flame, keeping it shuttered so the light barely kissed the wet stone of the floor. Behind him, the three women moved with a silence that was unnerving. They did not stumble over loose rocks. They did not splash in the puddles of condensation. They simply flowed, like ink spilled into water. This is dignified, Helen's voice floated out of the darkness dry as old parchment. Truly, I expected a carriage, perhaps a palanquin. Instead, I get a hole in the ground that smells like a pickled fish. It is a maintenance tunnel, Leonard grunted, not looking back. It keeps you away from the eyes of the port. Unless you prefer to walk down Main Street and explain why you do not have a heartbeat. I could explain it, Helen retorted. I could say I am heartbroken. It is very poetic. Silence, Margaret commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the shadows seem to press closer. Even in the dim light and even wrapped in the tattered tapestry she had looted from the station, she looked less like a refugee and more like an exiled queen inspecting a dungeon she intended to renovate. They reached a junction where the tunnel widened into a small, circular chamber used for water filtration. Leonard set the lantern down on a crate. We need to cover you up, he said, turning to face them. The tapestry is conspicuous. And the lace, he gestured to Rose, whose dress looked like it might disintegrate if the wind changed direction, is not exactly local fashion. He opened a rusted locker set into the wall. It was one of his stash points, a habit from the war he had never been able to break. Inside were bundles of gray ash voile, a cheap, coarse fabric used by the salt miners to protect their skin from the void burn. "Put these on," Leonard said, tossing the bundles to them. "Cover your heads. Cover your hands. In Brinegate, showing too much skin is considered a sign of madness or wealth. You have neither right now." Margaret caught the bundle with 2 fingers, holding it away from her body as if it were a dead rat. "Texture of sandpaper," she observed. "Delightful." "It is camouflage," Leonard said. "You want to blend in? You look like gray ghosts. That is the aesthetic of the populace." Rose unfolded her veil. She did not complain. She ran her fingers over the rough weave, her eyes wide, with that same unnerving curiosity she had shown at the station. She draped it over her head, letting the fabric fall around her shoulders. It transformed her instantly from a Gothic relic into a weary traveler, indistinguishable from the thousands of refugees who drifted through the Reach. "It smells like you," Rose said softly, inhaling the scent of the fabric. "Oil and metal. And something bitter." Leonard stiffened. "It is grease. Put it on." As they adjusted their disguises, Leonard checked the tunnel ahead. The path led directly to the sub-basement of his workshop. He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was bringing 3 apex predators into his home. He was bringing the very things the Dawn Synod preached against into the heart of their territory. "Tell me, locksmith," Margaret said, her voice muffled slightly by the veil. "Why is the city so quiet? I remember Brinegate. It used to roar. The shipyards, the taverns. Now it sounds like a hospital ward waiting for the lights to go out." Leonard hesitated. "It is the tithe." "The tithe?" Helen asked, peeking out from her gray shroud. "Money we have none, unless you count charm, of which I have an abundance." "Not money," Leonard said grimly. "Breath." He motioned for them to follow and led them up a spiraling metal staircase that groaned under his weight, but made no sound under theirs. "The Dawn Synod controls the Sun Relic," Leonard explained, as they climbed. "The relic is failing. It has been failing for 20 years. To keep it burning, the Synod claims it needs biological resonance, life force, heat." He pushed open the heavy hatch at the top of the stairs, emerging into the familiar cluttered space of his workshop. The smell of cold tea and ozone greeted him. He ushered the women inside and bolted the hatch, then threw 3 deadbolts on the main door. "Every winter solstice and whenever the light flickers like today," Leonard continued, keeping his voice low, "they collect the tithe of breath. Every citizen has to report to the district capacitor. You hook up to the machine. It drains you, just enough to make you weak, cold-tired for a month. If you refuse—" "Let me guess," Helen said, hopping up to sit on his workbench, her legs swinging. "They call you a traitor." "They call you a night feeder," Leonard said. "They say if you do not give your warmth to the sun, you are hoarding it for the darkness. They exile you to the lower drifts. You freeze in an hour." Margaret stood in the center of the room, her gray veil pooling around her like a monk's habit. She slowly pulled the fabric back from her face. Her expression was cold, hard fury. "Amateurs," she hissed. "Parasites." "It keeps the lights on," Leonard said defensively, though he didn't know why he was defending it. "It keeps us alive." "It keeps them in power," Margaret corrected. "The sun relics were designed to be self-sustaining. They draw power from the star well, not from the blood of peasants. If the relic is hungry, it is because someone broke the connection to the well. Or," she looked at Leonard significantly, "because the regulator is missing." "The regulator?" Leonard asked, moving to his small stove to reheat the kettle. He needed something to do with his hands. "The core," Margaret said. "The heart of the seal. It is not just a lock, Leonard. It is a conduit." When the station was sealed, the core was removed to ensure no one could activate the broadcast array. Without the core, the station is dormant, and the local relics are starving because the master signal is gone. She stepped closer to him. The workshop felt suddenly very small. "They call us too old," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you know why? Because we remember the contract. We are the wardens. We swore to guard the core until the war ended. But the war ended, and the Synod decided they preferred a populace that was tired and obedient to one that was safe and free. They locked us in. They labeled us monsters. And they started eating your people to keep their golden toy burning." Leonard poured the water. His hand shook just slightly. He gripped the handle of the kettle until his knuckles turned white. "I do not care about history," Leonard said. "I care about survival. You stay here. You stay quiet. When the heat dies down, I will find a smuggler to get you off the island. That is the extent of my hospitality." "Is it?" The voice was soft. Rose. She was standing by his vice grip. In her hand she held the broken key, the one he had been grinding this morning, the one he ground every morning. Leonard froze. "Put that down." Rose turned the key over in her pale fingers. She looked at the fresh scratch marks on the metal, the way the edge was honed to a razor sharpness that served no purpose for a blunt instrument. "You grind it every day," Rose said. It wasn't a question. "I can smell the fresh filings. I can smell the frustration in the metal." She looked up at him, her dark eyes, seemingly too large for her face. "Do you sharpen it to make it work again?" she asked. "Or do you sharpen it until there is nothing left of it? Are you trying to open a door, Leonard, or are you punishing the hand that holds the key?" Leonard walked over and snatched the key from her hand. The movement was aggressive, sudden. Rose did not flinch. She just watched him with a sadness that felt like a physical weight. "It is none of your business," Leonard snapped. He shoved the key into his pocket. "It is just scrap metal." "It is an anchor," Margaret observed from across the room. "We know about Anchor's locksmith. We have been chained to one for 60 years. Leonard turned his back on them, retreating to his tea. He poured the dark, sludge-like liquid into his mug and took a drink. The bitterness hit his tongue like a slap. It was grounding. It was real. "Why do you drink that?" Helen asked. She had picked up a screwdriver and was examining it as if it were a holy relic. "I can smell it from here. It smells like despair distilled into liquid form." "It wakes me up," Leonard said. "It smells like punishment," Helen said, tilting her head. "You humans are fascinating. You build prisons out of memories and drink poison to feel alive." She hopped off the bench and drifted toward him. She moved so fast Leonard didn't even see her take a step. Suddenly she was leaning against the wall right next to him, her face inches from his shoulder. "Tra Jang," Leonard muttered, using the old dialect word for the bitter root. "It helps me remember I am still standing." "Oh," Helen grinned, her fangs flashing briefly. "Well then, I will sit right here and watch you. If you start remembering too much or if you start enjoying the suffering, I might have to bite you. Just a little, to give you a new sensation to focus on." Leonard looked at her. Her eyes were mocking, but there was a sharpness behind them that wasn't about humor. She was guarding him. In her own twisted, predatory way, she was offering to be a buffer between him and his ghosts. "I do not need a babysitter," Leonard said. "You need a pack," Helen countered. "And currently we are it. Besides." She reached out and flicked the collar of his coat. "You opened the door. You bought the whole set. No returns." Margaret cleared her throat. The sound was like a gavel striking a desk. "Enough flirting, Helen. We have business." She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention. "Here is the arrangement, Leonard. The Synod wants us dead, because we are living proof that their tithe is a scam. They want you dead because you broke their seal. We are natural allies." "I am not your ally," Leonard said stubbornly. "I am a hostage of circumstance." "Semantics," Margaret waved a hand. "The deal is this. We will protect you. The Synod has soldiers, yes, but they do not have wardens. We can smell a lie at 50 paces and hear a heartbeat through a stone wall. We will keep their inquisitors off your back." "And in exchange?" Leonard asked. "In exchange," Margaret said, her eyes flashing steel gray, "you will help us find the core. We can sense its general direction, but we cannot touch it. It is Starstone tech. It needs a human interface. It needs a mechanic." "You want me to help you steal the most holy artifact in the sector?" Leonard asked, incredulously. "I want you to help us return a stolen engine part to its ignition slot," Margaret corrected, "before this entire floating rock turns into an ice cube." Leonard looked at the three of them: Margaret the general, Helen the warrior, Rose the mystic, and him, a man with a broken key and a tremor in his hand. "If I say no," Leonard asked. "Then we will likely be captured and executed," Rose said softly. "And you will be alone again, with your tea and your key." Leonard looked at his mug. The steam was rising in a thin gray spiral. He thought about the silence of his workshop before this morning. It had been safe, but it had also been a slow, suffocating death. "Fine," Leonard exhaled. "But we need supplies. I cannot fix a star core with a screwdriver and good intentions. I need flux coils, and for that I need to go to the market." "Excellent," Helen clapped her hands. "Shopping, I need a hat. This veil is depressing." "You are staying here," Leonard said firmly. "No," Margaret said. "We go with you. If the Synod is hunting, they will be hunting a solitary man. A man with 3 veiled relatives is invisible. It is a family outing," Leonard groaned. "You are going to get me killed." "We are going to keep you interesting," Helen winked. The Brinegate market was a chaotic, heaving organism of metal and desperate humanity. Stalls were jammed into every available inch of the plaza, beneath the flickering sun relic. The air smelled of ozone-frying algae cakes and unwashed bodies. Leonard walked through the crowd, his heart hammering a rhythm against his ribs. He felt exposed, naked. Around him, the 3 women moved in a tight formation. They wore the gray veils, walking with heads bowed, looking for all the world, like 3 pious widows, or perhaps 3 victims of the tithe, weakened and leaning on each other. But Leonard could feel the tension radiating off them. Every time a Synod guard passed heavy troopers, in white and gold armor, carrying solar pikes, he felt Helen tense up, ready to strike. He had to subtly elbow her to keep her walking. "Relax," he hissed under his breath. "You look like you are about to murder someone." "The one on the left smells like pork fat and cruelty," Helen whispered back. "He would be crunchy." "Do not eat the guards," Leonard muttered. They reached the stall of old Thomas, a salvage merchant who owed Leonard a dozen favors. Leonard was haggling for a set of high-grade conductive coils when the atmosphere in the market shifted. It was subtle at first. The noise dipped. The crowd parted. Silence rippled outward from the northern gate like a wave. Leonard turned slowly. Walking through the crowd was a man in robes of pure, blinding white. He did not walk. He glided. He was flanked by 4 heavy troopers, but no one looked at the soldiers. They looked at him, an inquisitor. He was tall, gaunt, with a face that looked like it had been carved from marble and left out in the rain. Around his neck hung a heavy chain of gold supporting a pendant as large as a dinner plate. The pendant was a sunburst, and in its center was a shard of glowing crystal, a sun detector, a holy amulet attuned to dark resonance. "Stay calm," Leonard whispered, though his own mouth was dry as dust. "Just keep your heads down." The Inquisitor was scanning the crowd. He wasn't looking for faces. He was watching the amulet. The crystal in the center was pulsing with a soft white light. Suddenly, the Inquisitor stopped. He turned. His eyes, devoid of any warmth, locked onto their sector of the market. The amulet flared. The light jumped from a soft pulse to a harsh, strobing beacon. "Corruption," the Inquisitor's voice rang out. It was a beautiful voice, rich and melodic, which made it all the more terrifying. "There is a shadow here," The crowd scrambled back, leaving a widening circle around Leonard and the three veiled women. Leonard froze. He was caught. There was no way out. The Inquisitor began to walk toward them, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The amulet was whining now, a high-pitched frequency that hurt the teeth. You, the Inquisitor pointed a gloved finger at Leonard, and your companions. Step forward. Leonard's hand drifted toward the heavy wrench in his belt. It was suicide. He knew it. But he wouldn't go to the tithe machines. Helen shifted her weight. Leonard could feel her preparing to launch. If she moved, it was a massacre, and then death. Wait! Rose's voice was a breath of wind. Before Leonard could stop her, Rose stumbled. She let out a low, pained moan and collapsed forward, slamming into Leonard's chest. Oh, please, she cried out, her voice thin and reedy. The sickness, it takes me. Leonard instinctively caught her. She was surprisingly heavy, or perhaps she was making herself heavy. She wrapped her arms around his torso, burying her veiled face into the front of his coat, right over his heart. My husband, Rose wailed, clutching him. The fever, do not let them take me. The Inquisitor stopped 10 feet away. He frowned. Sickness. She has the salt lung, Leonard stammered, improvising wildly. He wrapped his arms around Rose, pulling her tight. We are going to the infirmary. Please let us pass. The Inquisitor narrowed his eyes. He raised the amulet, aiming it directly at Rose and Leonard, like a weapon. The light detects impurity. Let me see her face. Leonard tightened his grip. Rose was trembling against him. But it wasn't fear. Do it, Rose whispered into his coat. Just hold me. Don't let go. The Inquisitor stepped closer. The amulet was blindingly bright. Then, something impossible happened. As Rose pressed her ear against Leonard's heart, and as Leonard's arms crushed her against his chest, the light in the amulet wavered. It didn't just dim. It was sucked away. Leonard felt a sudden sharp coldness in the center of his chest, like swallowing an ice cube. At the same moment, the blinding glare of the Inquisitor's pendant flickered and died out completely. The crystal went dark, turning into a dull gray rock. The Inquisitor stopped dead. He tapped the amulet. He shook it. Nothing. The high-pitched whine cut off. The crowd murmured. A holy device failing in the presence of sin was unheard of. It malfunctioned, the Inquisitor muttered, looking confused. He looked at Leonard, then at the sick woman clinging to him. Without the guiding light of the detector, all he saw was a dirty mechanic hugging a dying wife. The Inquisitor's face twisted in disgust. The salt lung is contagious. Get her out of here. Do not pollute the holy square. Yes. Yes, thank you, your grace. Leonard bowed his head, dragging Rose with him. Move, he hissed to Margaret and Helen. They shuffled away, maintaining the charade of a terrified family. They didn't run until they were 3 streets away, ducking into the labyrinth of the smog district. They didn't stop until they reached a secluded service alcove behind an abandoned processing plant. Leonard let go of Rose, and she stepped back, straightening her veil. She looked flushed. Her pale skin had a faint, rosy tint to it. Leonard, on the other hand, felt drained. He leaned against the brick wall, gasping for air. His chest felt cold, an aching void right behind his sternum. What? Leonard wheezed. What was that? Margaret stepped forward, ripping the veil from her face. She looked at Leonard with a new intensity. She grabbed his wrist, the left one, the one that shook, and pulled it up to her eye level. I thought it was a fluke, Margaret whispered. But the Inquisitor's stone didn't break Leonard. It was drained. Drained? Leonard pulled his hand back, but Margaret held firm. Her grip was like iron. Rose is a null amp, Margaret explained, glancing at the younger vampiress. She can dampen energy fields, but she cannot eat light, only reflect it. But when she touched you, Margaret pushed Leonard's sleeve up. There on the underside of his wrist, previously hidden by grease and grime, a mark had appeared. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a brand glowing with a faint, pulsing bioluminescence beneath the skin. It was a geometric shape, a circle intersected by a keyhole. The mark of the seal-bearer. "You swallowed the light," Margaret said, her voice filled with awe and horror. "The amulet reacted to you. It tried to purge you and you metabolized it." "I am a mechanic," Leonard said, his voice rising in panic. "I am not a battery." "You are not a battery," Helen said, stepping closer, her playful demeanor gone. She looked at the mark on his wrist. "You are the circuit. That is the mark of a Paladin commander, a seal-bearer, the only ones authorized to handle the core." "I was a grunt," Leonard denied, pulling his arm free. "I dug trenches. I fixed radios. I didn't command anything." "Memory suppression," Rose suggested softly. "Or maybe you didn't know. Maybe the station chose you when you broke the lock." Before Leonard could answer, the air above Brine shattered. Boom! A flare went up from the central spire of the Synod headquarters. It exploded into a massive sunburst of golden fireworks illuminating the entire smog-choked city. Then the voice returned. The great speakers roared. "Citizens, the shadow is among us. The holy devices have been sabotaged." The voice of High Prelate Gideon Kane was no longer cool. It was wrathful. "The breaker is here. We have his signature. By the authority of the dawn, we declare a vow trial." Leonard looked up at the sky. "Tomorrow at high noon, in the Sun Court, the breaker will present himself, or we will begin the purge of the low districts. 1 block every hour until he is found." Leonard felt the blood drain from his face. A purge. They would burn the homes of the poor, the people he lived with, the people whose kettles he fixed. "They are bluffing," Helen said, but she didn't sound convinced. "They are not," Leonard said quietly. "Kane does not bluff. He negotiates with fire." He looked at the 3 women. They were looking at him, not as a meal, not as a servant, but as a problem, a leader. "You have the mark," Margaret said. "That means you can handle the core, if we find it." "But if I go to the trial," Leonard said, "they will kill me." "If you do not go," Rose said, stepping into his shadow, "they will kill everyone else." Leonard looked at his wrist. The glowing mark was fading, sinking back under his skin, but the cold ache in his chest remained. He had swallowed the light. He had opened the door. He reached into his pocket and touched the broken key. It felt warm now. "I need to know what I am," Leonard whispered, "before I die for it." "Then we have work to do tonight," Margaret said, pulling her veil back up. "Because tomorrow, locksmith, you have a date with the sun." Leonard looked at them. The 3 monsters he had unleashed were now the only things standing between him and the light that wanted to burn him alive. "Let's go home," Leonard said. "I need more tea." And for the first time, when he said home, he didn't just mean the 4 walls where he hid. He meant the fight he was about to step into. The Sun Court was not designed for justice. It was designed for blindness. The architecture was a weapon of pure white marble and polished gold engineered to catch the output of the sun relic and amplify it until the air itself shimmered with heat. There were no shadows here. Every corner was illuminated, every crack exposed. It was a place where secrets went to burn. Leonard stood in the center of the vast circular plaza. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders, soaking his coat with sweat. He kept his hands in his pockets to hide the tremor, but today, the shaking was not from fear of the past. It was from the terrifying clarity of the present. Surrounding him were the tiered benches of the Dawn Synod, filled with the upper caste of Lumen Reach. They wore masks of white porcelain and robes of spun glass, looking down at him like specimens in a jar. But beyond them, penned behind energy barriers at the edge of the plaza, were the people of Brinegate. His people. He saw Thomas the salvage merchant looking old and small. He saw the mother whose child he had watched shivering yesterday. They looked terrified not of him, but of the light. Standing beside Leonard were the three veiled figures. In the harsh glare of the sun court, their gray ash-foil disguises looked fragile, like moth wings, ready to disintegrate. "It is too bright," Rose whispered. She was pressing close to Leonard's back, using his shadow as a shield. "The light, it tastes like salt and judgment." "Steady," Leonard murmured. "Do not look up. Do not speak unless I tell you." "I should have brought sunglasses," Helen muttered from his left. "Or a parasol. Or a very large hat made of lead. This is terrible for my complexion." "Focus, Helen." Margaret's voice was a steel rod stiffening their formation. She stood on Leonard's right, her head high despite the veil. "This is not a social outing. It is a theater. Play your part." At the far end of the plaza, atop a dais that seemed to float on a cushion of magnetic force, stood High Prelate Gideon Kane. Kane did not look like a monster. He looked like a savior. He wore vestments of woven fiber optics that glowed with a soft internal pulse. His face was unlined, serene, and terrible. In his hand he held a staff topped with a miniature containment field, a shard of a dead star. "Leonard of Bryngate," Kane's voice was amplified by the acoustics of the court, rolling over the crowd without the need for speakers. "You stand before the light. You are charged with breaking the ancient seal. You are charged with inviting the void back into our home." Leonard took a breath. The air tasted of ozone. "I fixed a lock, Prelate. The seal failed on its own. I just happened to be the one standing there when the door fell off." "And who," Kane gestured gracefully with his staff, pointing at the three women, "did you find behind that door?" The crowd held its breath. This was the moment. "Survivors," Leonard said loudly. "Just survivors of the old war. Refugees." Kane smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Refugees, let us see." He tapped his staff on the dais. A pulse of focused solar energy shot out not at Leonard, but at the barrier holding the Bryngate citizens. The barrier flared. A dozen people in the front row cried out, falling to their knees, as the energy sapped their strength. It was a controlled version of the tithe, a sudden violent extraction of warmth. "Stop!" Leonard stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he didn't have. "The light requires fuel, Leonard," Kane said softly. "The relic is hungry. Darkness has touched the system. To purge it, we need more breath, more warmth. Look at them. Look at your neighbors." Leonard watched as the mother he recognized collapsed, clutching her child. The child was crying, but soundlessly too weak to scream. "You can stop this," Kane said. "Give us the creatures. Admit they are the two old demons of the stories. Admit they are monsters. If you do, I will grant you absolution. I will spare Bryngate the tithe for a month." It was a trap. Leonard knew it. If he gave them up, the Synod would dissect them, weaponize them, or bind them to the relic to bleed them dry for eternity. But if he refused, "And if I do not," Leonard asked, his voice shaking. "Then you are a night feeder," Kane declared, "and you will be stripped of your citizenship. You will be cast into the lower mists, and these people will pay your debt with their lungs." Leonard looked at the crowd. He saw the pleading in their eyes. "Just give them up, Leonard. Just save us." He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Margaret. She stepped forward, ignoring the burning light that made her skin smoke slightly under the veil. "Do not calculate the cost, locksmith," Margaret said. Her voice was not whispered. It was projected clear and regal. "You are trying to do the math of survival. 1 life for 100. 3 lives for a town." "It is good math," Leonard hissed. "It is the math of war." "It is the math of cowards," Margaret said. She turned him to face her. Through the thin fabric of the veil, he could see her silver eyes. "You do not owe us your life, Leonard. We are strangers. But you owe yourself something better than this. You spent 10 years grinding a key to punish yourself for following orders." Do not start following them again." "She is right," Helen chimed in. She had moved to stand in front of him, shielding him from Kane's gaze. "Besides, if you surrender us, I will be very annoyed. And I tend to break things when I am annoyed." "This is not the time for jokes, Helen," Leonard said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It is always time for jokes," Helen said. She turned her head, and for a second, her voice dropped the bravado. It was small, terrified, and painfully human. "Because if I stop laughing, Leonard, I am going to scream. And I do not want to die screaming." Kane raised his staff again. The light intensified. The crowd in the pen groaned as the heat rose. "Choose," Kane bellowed. "The monsters or the people?" Leonard looked at Kane. Then he looked at the mother clutching her child. He remembered the war. He remembered the orders. Close the door. Seal the bunker. Ignore the knocking. He had ignored the knocking for 10 years. "No," Leonard said. It wasn't a shout. It was a simple, flat refusal. "What did you say?" Kane asked, leaning forward. "I said no," Leonard said, his voice rising. "I am done closing doors on people." He reached out and ripped the veil off Margaret's head. Then Helen's. Then Rose's. The crowd gasped. The 3 women stood revealed in the harsh light, pale, beautiful, and undeniably other. Their eyes reflected the light like gemstones. Their fangs were visible as they hissed at the sudden brightness. "There!" Kane shouted triumphantly. "Behold the fangs! Behold the hunger!" "They are not hungry," Leonard shouted back. "You are. You are the one eating this town alive." Kane's face twisted. The mask of benevolence vanished. "Kill him. Kill the traitor. Take the beasts." The tears of the synod erupted. From the side gates, the dawn wards emerged. They were not human. They were constructs of brass and quartz, powered by miniature sun cores. They stood 8 feet tall, carrying halberds of burning plasma. There were 12 of them. "Leonard," Rose said. She was trembling violently. The light was hurting her. "We cannot fight sun constructs. We have no armor. We have no anchor." "I am your anchor," Leonard said, pulling the wrench from his belt. It felt ridiculously light against giant robots. "Not like this," Rose said. She grabbed his left hand. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of ancient knowledge. "The bond is loose. It is just words. We need blood. We need the vow." "Rose, no," Margaret warned, stepping between them and the advancing constructs. "He is human. The night vow could stop his heart." "Or it could start it," Rose said. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for Leonard to understand. Rose lifted Leonard's wrist to her mouth. She didn't look like a predator. She looked like a desperate woman praying at an altar. "By the salt, by the stone, by the dark between stars," Rose chanted the words, vibrating against Leonard's skin. She bit down. It wasn't painful. That was the shock of it. It felt like a jolt of electricity, cold and sharp, racing up his arm and slamming directly into his chest. Leonard gasped, arching his back. The world slowed down. He felt the connection snap into place. It wasn't just Rose. He felt Margaret's iron will. He felt Helen's frenetic speed. He felt their heartbeats slow, dormant echoes, suddenly sync with his own. Thump, 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 thump. The fangs didn't tear his flesh. They sank into the energy of his blood, and then they locked. Rose pulled back, gasping. Her mouth was stained with a single drop of blood, but her eyes were glowing with a terrifying violet luminescence. "Done," Rose whispered. "The circuit is closed." Leonard looked at his wrist. The geometric brand he had seen in the alley was now burning through his coat sleeve. It wasn't just a tattoo anymore. It was a beacon. And the 3 women changed. The lethargy of the too old vanished. Margaret grew taller shadows, wrapping around her like armor. Helen's fingernails elongated into obsidian claws. Rose didn't change physically, but the air around her began to warp, bending the light away. "Guard him," Margaret commanded. Her voice was no longer a cello. It was a war horn. The first Dawn Ward lunged, bringing its plasma halberd down in a crushing arc, meant to split Leonard in two. Clang. Margaret caught the blade. She didn't use a weapon. She caught the burning plasma shaft with her bare hand. The shadow armor on her skin hissed, neutralizing the heat. "You are rude," Margaret snarled. She twisted her wrist, and the brass shaft of the halberd snapped like a twig. Helen flank. Helen was a blur. She moved faster than the human eye could track. She vaulted off Leonard's shoulder, a spinning vortex of gray fabric and claws. She landed on the back of the second construct, jamming her hand into the quartz core on its neck. "Deactivation protocols," Helen laughed maniacally. "I love taking things apart." She ripped the core out. The construct powered down, instantly collapsing into a heap of scrap metal. But there were 10 more. And Kane was not idle. "Abominations!" Kane screamed. He aimed high staff. "Burn them!" A beam of concentrated sunlight, thick as a tree trunk, shot from the staff, aimed directly at Leonard. Leonard couldn't dodge. He was the anchor. If he moved, the connection would break. "Leonard!" Helen screamed, trying to scramble back. Leonard didn't run. He didn't hide. He raised his left hand. The hand with the tremor. The hand with the mark. He didn't think about it. He just felt the shape of the energy coming at him. It was a frequency. A code. It was the same energy he had manipulated in the bunker 10 years ago. "Access denied!" Leonard roared. It wasn't English. It was a harsh, guttural sound, the language of the command protocols. The mark on his wrist flared white. The beam of sunlight hit his hand and shattered. It didn't burn him. It hit an invisible wall of authority and diffracted, scattering into harmless sparks of light that rained down around him like confetti. Silence fell over the sun court. Kane stared. The high prelate looked at his staff, then at the mechanic standing amidst the wreckage. "Impossible," Kane whispered. "Only a paladin, only a seal-bearer can countermand the source." Leonard lowered his hand. The tremor was gone. His hand was steady as stone. "You are trespassing, Gideon," Leonard said. His voice sounded different, deeper. It carried the resonance of the station. "You are using a Class 4 power core to execute civilians. That is a violation of the armistice." "I am the law," Kane shrieked. He slammed his staff down. "Kill them all. Wards override safety limits. Execute." The remaining constructs surged forward, their cores glowing red. They weren't trying to capture anymore. They were overloading for self-destruct sequences. "They are going to detonate!" Margaret shouted, backing up to shield Leonard. "Leonard, get down!" Leonard looked at the pen of civilians. If the constructs exploded here, Brinegate's people would be vaporized. "No," Leonard said. He looked at Rose. She was standing beside him, her hand on his chest, feeding him strength, stabilizing his heart. "Rose," Leonard said, "can you amplify me?" Rose looked at him, fear and trust warring in her eyes. "I can try. But you might burn out. You are human." "I am not just human today," Leonard said. "I am the breaker." He grabbed Rose's hand. "Helen, Margaret, defensive perimeter, protect the civilians." "On it," Helen yelled. She abandoned the fight and leaped toward the barrier, holding the townspeople. "Move back, you idiots! Move back!" Margaret stood like a tower of shadow between the crowd and the robots. Leonard stepped forward, facing the charging machines. He closed his eyes. He visualized the station. He visualized the seal he had broken. He visualized the key he had ground down every morning. Grind it until it fits. He reached out with his mind past the heat, past the noise, finding the frequency of the constructs. They were old tech. They were his tech. "System halt," Leonard commanded. He slammed his fist into the marble floor. The mark on his wrist exploded with a shockwave of null energy. It rippled outward across the plaza. When the wave hit the constructs, they didn't explode. They froze. Their red lights flickered and turned to a dull, confused Amber. The heavy brass bodies crashed to the ground momentum, carrying them forward until they slid to a halt at Leonard's feet. The silence was deafening. Leonard stood up, swaying slightly. Smoke was rising from his coat. The connection to the vampiresses was humming in his veins like a second nervous system. "You," Kane was backing away, his face pale. "You stole the command codes." "I didn't steal them," Leonard wheezed. "I earned them, in the trenches, while you were hiding in your tower." Leonard took a step toward the dais. "Unlock the civilians, now." Kane looked panicked. He looked at the sky. "You do not understand. You broken fool. The relic needs the tithe without it." Scream! The sound didn't come from the plaza. It came from the sky. It was a sound like metal, tearing amplified 1,000,000,000 times. It was a scream that vibrated in the teeth of every person in Lumen Reach. Everyone looked up. Far above the cloud layer, the silhouette of Station X was visible. But it was changing. The great stone asteroid was moving. The chains holding it were groaning. And from the center of the station, the place where Leonard had broken the seal, a beam of absolute devouring darkness shot downward. It wasn't attacking. It was searching. The darkness hit the sun relic in the center of the court. The relic didn't fight back. It turned black. Instantly, the artificial day of the sun court vanished. The lights died. The heat vanished. True night fell over Lumen Reach. The only light came from the stars above and the glowing mark on Leonard's wrist. "What did you do?" Kane whispered in the darkness. "I didn't do that," Leonard said, looking up in horror. "The core," Margaret said, her voice grim. She appeared at Leonard's side, her eyes glowing like beacons in the dark. "The station is not just open, Leonard. It is awake. It realizes its heart is missing, and it is coming to take it back." "The relic," Helen said, pointing to the blackened sphere. "The relic was using the stolen core. That is why the Synod had power." Kane let out a wail of despair. "The light is gone. We are lost." The crowd began to panic. The cold of the void rushed in instantly. Leonard grabbed Kane by his expensive robes. "Where is the core, Gideon? The real one. The one you stole from the station to power your toy." Kane was gibbering. "It is in the vault, beneath the relic. But you cannot touch it. It will kill you." "We have to move," Leonard shouted to the vampiresses. "We have to get the core back to the station. If we don't, that rift," he pointed up. The beam of darkness was widening. It was tearing the sky apart. Stars were falling, literal meteorites of burning debris, raining down on the city. "This is not a political dispute anymore," Leonard said, gripping his wrench. "This is an apocalypse." Helen laughed, but it was a shaky sound. "Well, at least I do not have to wear the veil anymore." Rose squeezed Leonard's hand. Her skin was ice cold, but the bond between them was burning hot. "Your heart is steady," Rose whispered. "Lead us, locksmith." Leonard looked at the terrified people of Brinegate, huddled in the sudden dark. "Brisa!" Leonard yelled into the crowd. Warden Brisa appeared at the edge of the barrier. "Leonard, what the hell is happening?" "Get them to the deep shelters," Leonard commanded. "The sky is falling. I am going to fix the roof." He turned to his team, his pack. "Margaret, take point. Helen, watch our backs. Rose, keep me alive." "Always, my love," Helen quipped, though she had extended her claws fully. "I hate being a widow, remember?" Leonard looked at the high dais where the vault entrance lay. "Let's go steal the sun," Leonard said. He began to run, the three shadows flowing around him, charging into the dark to save the world that had tried to burn them. The journey back to Station X was not a retreat. It was an ascension into a graveyard of stars. They moved through the weeping reaches, a sector of the cloud layer where the atmospheric scrubbers had failed decades ago. Here, the salt from the ocean below mixed with the dust of falling meteors, creating a perpetual stinging rain that crusted everything in white rime. Leonard walked at the front of the group. He carried the stolen core in a lead-lined satchel, slung across his chest. It was not physically heavy, no more than a few pounds, but it felt like he was carrying a collapsed star against his ribs. The mark on his wrist, the geometric brand of the seal-bearer, throbbed in time with the object in the bag. Thump, 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 thump. It was a second heartbeat, louder and colder than his own. Behind him, the three women moved with the grim determination of soldiers marching into exile. They had discarded the tattered gray veils. Out here in the wild darkness, there was no one to hide from but the elements. Margaret walked with her head high, though the wind whipped her velvet gown around her legs. Helen prowled the flank, her eyes scanning the swirling mists for pursuit. Rose stayed close to Leonard, her hand occasionally brushing his arm, checking the temperature of his skin. "We are being heralded," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. She pointed toward the distant flickering lights of Bryngate far below them. Leonard looked back. Even from this distance, through the breaks in the clouds, he could see the change. The warm, golden glow of the harbor was gone. In its place were harsh, blue-white searchlights that swept the streets like prison bars. "The Synod has locked the port," Leonard said, his voice rough from the salt air. "They are squeezing the city." "They are starving it," Helen corrected. She paused, sniffing the air. "I can smell the ozone from here. They have cranked the tithe machines up to maximum output. They are trying to jump-start the relic by draining the populace dry." Leonard gripped the strap of the satchel. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had saved them from the immediate massacre in the Sun Court, but he had left them in a cage. "I should have stayed," Leonard muttered. "I should have fought Cain there." "And you would be a pile of ash," Margaret said. She moved up beside him, her stride matching his. "And the core would be back in Cain's vault, and the night would eventually swallow everything. You cannot be a martyr and a mechanic at the same time, Leonard. Martyrs are useless. They are just broken tools." "I feel like a broken tool," Leonard admitted. He looked at his hands. The tremor was gone, replaced by the supernatural steadiness of the seal-bearer's power, but that terrified him more. "The codes, the command protocols I used in the plaza. They felt too familiar, Margaret. It felt like 10 years ago. Like I was just aiming a weapon." He stopped, turning to face her. The salt rain hissed against his coat. "I ran away to be a locksmith," Leonard whispered. "I fixed kettles. I fixed boat engines. I made things work. But the moment I touched this power, I turned into a weapon again. I shut down those machines. I threatened a priest. I am just a gun someone left on the table." Margaret stopped. She reached out and took his face in her hands. Her skin was cool, smooth as marble. Her eyes, ancient and steel gray, locked onto his. "Listen to me, soldier," she said firmly. "A weapon does not choose where to aim. A weapon does not choose to spare the child or save the town. You made a choice." She tapped the satchel on his chest. "You are carrying the heart of a star system. That does not make you a gun. It makes you the keeper. You are not a weapon, Leonard. You are the one holding the keys. And the key is heavy. It is supposed to be heavy." Leonard leaned into her touch for a second, closing his eyes. The validation was a lifeline. "Keep walking," Margaret said, softly releasing him. "The station is awake. It is waiting for us." They made camp that night, though day and night had become meaningless concepts in the eternal twilight of the breach, in a shallow cave carved into a floating chunk of quartz. It was freezing. The cold of the void seeped through the rock, settling in their bones. Leonard started a small fire using chemical tablets from his kit. The blue flame gave off no smoke, but it offered meager heat. He sat with his back against the cave wall, trying to sleep. The core in the bag was humming a low frequency that vibrated his teeth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of the plasma cannons in the Sun Court. He saw the mother clutching her child. He saw the darkness tearing the sky. He couldn't sleep. His heart was racing a frantic staccato rhythm of panic. Then he felt a weight settle against his chest. He opened his eyes. Rose had curled up next to him. She wasn't just sitting. She had practically folded herself into the space between his arm and his ribs, resting her head directly over his heart. Leonard stiffened. "Rose." "Hush," she whispered. Her eyes were closed. She looked impossibly young and fragile in the firelight, her lace dress torn and stained with salt. "You are crowding me," Leonard grumbled, though he didn't push her away. "I am not a piece of furniture." "You are loud," Rose murmured. "Your heart. It is skipping beats. It is running like a frightened rabbit." "I am having a nightmare while I am awake," Leonard said. "It is a talent." Rose shifted, pressing her ear firmer against his chest. "I am listening to the rhythm. The night vow connects us. If I focus on your heart, I can slow it down, like a metronome." Leonard sighed, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. "You know I am not a pillow, right? I am a grimy mechanic covered in salt dust." "I know," Rose said. She didn't move. "But you are warm. You are the warmest thing in this cold world, Leonard." She moved her hand, slipping her fingers through his, interlacing them. "Besides," she added softly, "if I am here, the nightmares cannot get to your chest. I am guarding the door." Leonard looked down at her. He looked at the pale curve of her neck, the delicate eyelashes resting against her cheek. He felt the terrifying, overwhelming surge of affection that he had been trying to drown in bitter tea for weeks. "Fine," Leonard whispered. "But if you drool on my coat, I am leaving you on the mountain." Rose smiled, her eyes still closed. "Deal." Across the fire, Helen was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, sharpening her claws with a piece of obsidian. Scrape, scrape. The sound was eerily similar to Leonard's morning ritual with his key. She wasn't looking at them. She was staring into the dark entrance of the cave, her expression uncharacteristically grim. "You are quiet," Leonard said to her. "It is unnerving. Usually you would have made 3 jokes about my snoring by now." Helen stopped scraping. She looked at the fire. "I recognized him." "Who?" "Kane," Helen said. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual manic energy. "When we were in the plaza, I recognized his energy signature. Not the man himself, he is too young, but the lineage, the power." She looked up, her eyes flashing with a sudden feral red. 60 years ago, before the seal was fully closed, there was a purge. A sect of the Dawn Priests found one of our nurseries, a sanctuary for the young wardens who hadn't fully turned. Leonard went still. Rose stopped breathing against his chest. "They didn't use stakes," Helen said softly. "They used fire. They burned the sanctuary to the ground. I was the only one who got out. I smelled the smoke for decades." She pointed a claw at the darkness outside. "Kane wields that same fire. He is the successor of the men who burned my family. When I saw him on that dais, all I wanted to do was rip his throat out. I wanted to paint that white marble with his blood." "Why didn't you?" Leonard asked. Helen looked at him. Then she looked at the bag on his chest. Then at Rose. "Because I saw the children in the pen," Helen said quietly. "The human children. They were fainting. They were dying of the cold." She let out a shaky breath, returning to her scraping. "If I had attacked Kane, the wards would have detonated. The children would have died. And I would have been exactly what he says I am, a monster." She looked at Leonard, a sad, crooked smile appearing on her face. "You ruined me, locksmith. Before you opened that door, I was just a set of fangs waiting for revenge. Now I have a conscience. It is incredibly inconvenient." Leonard looked at her sharp, dangerous, terrified Helen, and felt a profound respect. "It is not inconvenient," Leonard said. "It is the only thing that matters." "Go to sleep, Leonard," Helen muttered, turning away to hide her face. "I will take first watch. If Kane comes, I promise I will wake you before I eat him." The next day, the ascent became vertical. Station X hung above them, a massive, brooding Gothic cathedral, fused into an asteroid. The chains that tethered it to the lower islands were as thick as city blocks, covered in ice and rust. They climbed the maintenance ladder of the primary anchor chain. It was a brutal climb, thousands of feet above the swirling abyss. The wind tried to tear them off the rungs. When they finally reached the landing bay of the station, Leonard was exhausted. His muscles burned and the air was so thin, he was gasping for every breath. But the station was not dead. As Leonard's boot touched the landing deck, a ripple of light shuddered through the stone floor. It wasn't electrical. It was bioluminescent glowing veins of blue and violet spreading out from his footprint. "Welcome, bearer." The stone seemed to vibrate into the soles of his feet. "It knows you," Margaret said. She was looking around at the familiar architecture, the soaring arches, the gargoyles, the silent courtyards with a look of painful nostalgia. "It has been sleeping. Now it feels the key." They moved deeper into the complex. The station was a labyrinth. It wasn't built on logic. It was built on faith and defensive strategy. Corridors twisted back on themselves. Gravity shifted subtly, so that sometimes down was the wall. And the station was testing them. They came to a massive blast door made of solid star glass. There was no handle, no keypad, no lock. Only an inscription carved into the glass in the old tongue. "What is the price of light?" Leonard stepped forward. He raised his hand, the mark glowing. "Override," he commanded. The door didn't budge. "It is not a command code," Rose said softly. She traced the letters. "It is a question, Leonard." The station was built by paladins who feared their own power. They built safeguards. Moral safeguards. "Great." Leonard wiped sweat from his eyes. "A philosophical door. Just what we need." "What is the price of light?" Helen repeated. "Fuel energy." "No," Leonard said. He thought of the tithe. He thought of the shivering child. He thought of the soldiers he had buried 10 years ago. He placed his hand flat against the glass. "Shadow," Leonard said. "The price of light is the shadow it casts. You cannot have one without the other." The glass hummed. It turned from opaque to transparent, then slid silently into the wall. "Correct," Margaret noted, walking through. "The station appreciates balance. Cain and his synod have forgotten that. They try to have light without shadow, and they end up burning the world." They pushed on, passing through chambers that held rows of silent, sleeping machinery generators, atmospheric scrubbers, defense arrays, all dormant, all waiting for the core. But they were not alone. Leonard heard it first. A low, rhythmic chanting echoing through the ventilation shafts. The light purifies. The light demands. The light takes. "They are here," Leonard said, unholstering his wrench, though it felt pitifully inadequate. "How?" Helen hissed. "We climbed the chain. No ship could dock in this storm." "They didn't use a ship," Rose whispered, pointing out a viewport. Outside, crawling up the massive anchor chains like a swarm of white ants, were hundreds of figures. They weren't soldiers. They were citizens. Ordinary people robed in white climbing, with a fanatical, unnatural strength. "The tithe," Leonard realized with horror. "Cain is using the energy he drained from them. He's driving them like puppets." They reached the central nave, a massive vaulted chamber that led to the sanctum of the seal. And there, waiting for them, was Gideon Cain. He stood in the center of the nave, flanked not by his brass constructs, but by a wall of living human beings. Men and women from Brinegate, their eyes glazed over with white light, their bodies gaunt and trembling. They formed a human shield between Leonard and the inner door. Cain looked serene. He held a scroll of parchment in one hand, and his staff in the other. "Welcome home, sisters," Cain called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "And you, Leonard." "You made good time." Leonard stopped. The 3 vampiresses fanned out, but they hesitated. They couldn't attack. The shield was made of victims. "Let them go, Cain," Leonard shouted. "This is between you and the station." "It is all connected, Leonard," Cain smiled. He raised the parchment. "I bear a holy writ, a mandate of the dawn. It declares that any entity impeding the restoration of the sun is an enemy of the species. He gestured to the glazed-eyed citizens. These people know who the enemy is. They know who stole their warmth, who turned off their sun. "You did," Leonard roared. "Did I?" Kane asked. He turned to the crowd of thralls. "Who is the traitor who broke the seal, who brought the dark?" Hundreds of fingers raised. Hundreds of voices spoke in a terrifying monotone unison. Leonard. The Breaker. Leonard. The Night Feeder. It was a psychological firing squad. Leonard flinched. These were the people he had fixed locks for. The people he had shared tea with. "They do not know what they are saying," Margaret said, stepping close to him. "It is the tithe sickness. He is controlling them." "It works because they are afraid," Kane said softly. "Fear is a powerful lens, Leonard. It focuses the mind." Kane took a step forward. The human wall moved with him. "Give me the core," Kane commanded, "and I will let them breathe. I will let them go home. Refuse, and I will burn them all out right here to fuel my ascension." He raised his staff. The tip began to glow. The people in the front row screamed as their life force was siphoned into the weapon. "No," Helen shouted, lunging forward, but Margaret held her back. "He will do it," Margaret warned. "He will kill them all to get to us." Leonard looked at the suffering people. He looked at the core in his bag. If he gave it to Kane, Kane would lock the station forever. The vampires would be hunted down. The tithe would become eternal. But if he fought, he would have to carve through his own neighbors. Leonard closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. "I am not a weapon." He opened his eyes. He looked at Kane. "You want a villain," Leonard said quietly. "Fine." He unslung the bag. He held it up. "Leonard, no," Rose cried out. Leonard ignored her. He stepped forward away from the protection of the vampiresses. He walked until he was face to face with the human wall. "I am the Breaker," Leonard shouted, his voice amplified by the station's acoustics. He spoke to the thralls, not Kane. "I am the one who opened the door. I am the one who stole the key." He looked at old Thomas, who was standing in the front row, eyes white and vacant. "Thomas," Leonard said, "I fixed your boat. I charged you double last week. You hate me for it." Thomas blinked. A flicker of recognition. "I am the reason you are cold," Leonard yelled. "So take me, let them go, Kane. You want the Breaker, here I am. Trade me for them." "A noble gesture," Kane sneered. "But I can take you and keep them." "No," Leonard said. He reached into the bag. He didn't pull out the core. He pulled out the broken key, the one he had ground for 10 years. He held it up. It wasn't a key to a physical lock. It was a piece of conductive star metal, honed to a perfect frequency. "This station listens," Leonard said. "It listens to intent." He jammed the broken key into a slot on his own mechanical tool gauntlet on his left arm. He slammed his hand against the floor. "Protocol Sanctuary," Leonard commanded. The floor of the nave groaned. Suddenly, gravity shifted. Not for everyone. Just for the civilians. The floor beneath the human wall tilted 90 degrees. The civilians slid, gently guided by anti-grav fields, away from Kane, sliding down a chute that opened in the floor. It was a cargo disposal chute, leading to the lower safety nets. "What?" Kane screamed, swinging his staff. "Run!" Leonard shouted to the vampiresses. "Get to the sanctum, I will hold him." "We are not leaving you," Margaret yelled. "Go," Leonard roared. "I am the distraction. You are the wardens, guard the core." He threw the bag, a long, desperate arc. Helen leaped into the air, catching the heavy satchel with impossible grace. She looked at Leonard, her eyes wide with panic and respect. "Go!" Leonard screamed. Kane turned his staff on Leonard. "You fool!" A blast of solar fire erupted. Leonard raised his arm. The mark flared. He caught the blast, gritting his teeth. The heat was unbearable. His coat began to smoke. "Margaret," Helen landed by the inner door. "We have to go. If we don't, his sacrifice means nothing." Margaret looked at Leonard. He was standing alone in the center of the nave, a small, stubborn figure holding back a tidal wave of light with one shaking hand. "Run," Leonard mouthed to her. Margaret grabbed Rose, who was sobbing, reaching out for him. "Forgive us," Margaret whispered. She dragged Rose through the inner door. Helen followed. The door slammed shut. Leonard was alone with Kane. The blast of light intensified. Leonard's shield began to crack. He was pushed back, his boots skidding on the stone. "You think you have won." Kane walked toward him, the light swirling around him like a god. "You just trapped yourself in a dead end." "I didn't trap myself," Leonard gritted out, blood trickling from his nose. "I just cleared the room." He fell to one knee. The energy was too much. The mark was burning his flesh. Kane stood over him. He lowered the staff. The pressure eased just enough for Leonard to breathe. "Where is the core going, Leonard?" Kane asked softly. "To the sanctum good. My wards are already cutting through the side vents. They will be waiting for your witches." Kane grabbed Leonard by the collar and hauled him up. "But you are valuable. You manipulated the station's gravity. You accessed the sanctuary protocols. You are not just a mechanic." Kane dragged Leonard toward the inner door. He placed his hand on the panel, blowing the lock with a pulse of holy fire. "Come," Kane whispered. "Let us see the end together." They walked into the sanctum. It was a circular chamber, open to the stars above. In the center stood the altar of the seal, a massive pedestal of black obsidian, pulsing with faint, dying red light. Margaret, Helen, and Rose were there. They were surrounded by a dozen dawn wards, the ones Kane had sent through the vents. They were fighting a desperate losing battle. "Stop!" Kane commanded. The wards froze. Kane shoved Leonard forward. Leonard stumbled, falling to the floor near the altar. "Look," Kane said, pointing to the altar. Leonard looked up. The altar was not a flat surface. In the center there was a depression, a socket waiting for the core. But as Leonard looked closer, his blood ran cold. The socket wasn't square. It wasn't round. It was shaped like a human heart. And around the socket, carved into the stone, were words in the old tongue that Leonard could finally read clearly. "The lock requires blood. The key is a life," Kane laughed. It was a sound of pure, triumphant madness. "You see, Leonard," Kane walked over to the altar. He looked at the core, which Helen was clutching to her chest. "The core is just the battery," Kane said. "But the circuit needs a fuse, a biological fuse." He pointed a finger at Leonard. "Why do you think the station woke up for you? Why do you think the mark is on your chest over your heart and not just your hand?" Leonard looked down. His shirt was torn. Beneath it, the glowing geometric lines had spread. They were centered directly over his heart. "You are the final piece," Kane whispered. "To close the seal, to lock the night away forever," Kane smiled. "You have to put the core in the socket, and then you have to put your heart on top of it." Kane looked at Rose, who had gone pale as death. "He has to die to save you," Kane said to the vampiresses. "He has to die to lock the door. Or he can let the door stay open and the night will consume the sun and everyone freezes." Kane spread his arms. "Choose Breaker. Be the hero. Be the sacrifice. Give me your heart." Leonard stared at the heart-shaped hole in the stone. He felt the night vow humming in his veins. He looked at Rose. If he locked the door, the vampiresses would be trapped here forever, branded as monsters, while the Synod ruled a world of enforced light. If he didn't, the world ended. "The key," Leonard whispered, thinking of his morning ritual. "I was grinding it to fit." He realized now what he had been preparing for all these years. He stood up. He walked toward the altar. "Leonard, no," Rose breathed. Leonard looked at her. He smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. "It is okay," he said. "I finally found a lock I can fix." He reached out his hand for the core. But as his fingers brushed the cold stone, a new thought sparked in his mind. A thought that wasn't about opening or closing. It was about breaking. He looked at Kane. "You want my heart?" Leonard asked. The air crackled with silence. The final choice hung between them like a guillotine blade. The altar of the seal hummed with a sound that was less like a machine and more like a dying breath. It was a low, resonant vibration that rattled the teeth and settled deep in the marrow of the bone. In the center of the obsidian pedestal, the heart-shaped depression pulsed with a hungry red bioluminescence, waiting for the component that would complete the circuit. High Prelate Gideon Kane stood by the altar, his white robes billowing in the updraft of the sanctum's ventilation. He looked like a statue of purity carved from ice, unblemished and utterly cold. "It is a simple equation, Leonard," Kane said, his voice smooth and terrible in the echoing chamber. "The station was built to hold back the infinite dark. A door this heavy requires a lock. A lock this powerful requires a living current. The original paladins understood this. They gave their hearts literally to ensure the sun would rise for another century." Leonard stood at the edge of the dais. His chest heaved with exertion, the mark glowing fiercely beneath his torn shirt. He looked at the altar, then at the three women standing near the blast door, surrounded by the wreckage of the dawn wards they had dismantled. Margaret was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, the blood dark and sluggish. Helen was favoring her left leg, her claws retracted but her eyes burning with impotent rage. Rose was unhurt, but she looked translucent, as if the sheer weight of the station's demand was fading her out of existence. "You call them too old," Leonard said, his voice raspy. He gripped his wrench, though against this kind of magic it was just a piece of metal. "Why? Because they are useless. Because they are weak." Kane laughed softly. "Oh no, they are not useless. They are the three wardens. Look at them, Leonard. Really look at them." Leonard glanced back. Margaret stood tall, her silhouette sharp against the gloom. "They are too old because they belong to the Old Covenant," Kane explained, gesturing with his staff. "Before the Synod, before the Tithe, there were the wardens. They did not just guard the door. They were the door. They volunteered to carry the fangs of the seal, the biological interface that allows them to channel the station's energy. They guarded the sleep of the galaxy for 300 years. Margaret stepped forward, her voice ringing out like a bell. "We guarded it with honor, Kane. We did not drain the life from the people we were sworn to protect. Honor does not keep the lights on." Kane snapped, his facade of calm cracking for a second. "The war ended. The paladins died. Who was left to pay the bill the Synod took over? We realized that people do not want honor. They want warmth. They want safety. And they will pay any price for it." He turned his eyes back to Leonard. "But the wardens were a problem. They remembered the old ways. They remembered that the light was supposed to be free. So we locked them in. We branded them monsters. We called them too old to function obsolete hardware in a new world." Kane pointed a gloved finger at Leonard's chest. "And now here you are, the seal bearer. The one soul the station has been waiting for since the last paladin fell. You opened the door not by accident, Leonard. You opened it because the station tasted your blood and recognized a compatible donor." Leonard looked down at the mark on his wrist. The geometric lines were pulsing in sync with the red light on the altar. Thump, 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 thump. "I am not a donor," Leonard whispered. "I am a mechanic." "Then fix it," Kane shouted. "Place the core in the socket. Place your heart on the core. The seal will fuse. The station will lock down for another 1,000 years. The night will be banished. The Synod will rule, yes, but humanity will survive. And them," Leonard pointed to the vampiresses. "They are loose ends," Kane said dismissively. "If you lock the seal, they will be cut off from the source. They will wither. Or we will hunt them down as the cautionary tale they were meant to be. A small price for the salvation of millions." Leonard looked at the core in Helen's hands. It was a heavy sphere of pulsating star metal. He looked at the heart-shaped hole. He looked at Rose. Rose walked toward him. She moved slowly, ignoring Cain, ignoring the humming altar. She stopped inches from Leonard. She reached out and placed her hand over his heart, right over the glowing mark. "Do not do it," Rose whispered. Her eyes were vast and dark, filled with a sadness that spanned centuries. "If I do not," Leonard said, his voice trembling, "the rift stays open. The cold will kill everyone in Brinegate, including Thomas, including the children." "If you do," Margaret said, stepping up behind Rose, "you die, and Cain wins. He gets his martyr, and he gets to keep his boot on the neck of this world forever." "At least I will be clean," Leonard said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "No more running, no more grinding keys. Just one last job." Margaret grabbed his shoulder. Her grip was strong, painful. "You think death is a way to clean your ledger? That is a coward's logic, soldier. I would rather live as a monster in a world that hates me than be mined by your sacrifice. Do not dare leave me alone with that guilt." It wasn't a command. It was a confession. Beneath the steel of the warden, Margaret was terrified. Not of dying, but of losing the one thing that had made the last few days feel like life. Helen hobbled over, leaning against the altar, as if she were bored, though her eyes were red-rimmed. "Hey," Helen said, poking Leonard in the ribs. "If you are planning to become a piece of architectural masonry, at least give me 2 weeks' notice. I have not even had a chance to spend your money yet." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Do not die, Leonard. I hate being a widow, especially when I never even got the wedding cake." Leonard looked at them, his pack, his family. He looked at Cain, who was watching with a sneer of impatience. "Touching," Cain said. "But the sky is tearing open, Leonard. Decide. Who do you want to be? The hero who died to save the world, or the traitor who let it burn for the sake of 3 monsters?" Leonard closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the core in his mind. He felt the intricate, massive machinery of Station X waiting for a command. He remembered the key he ground every morning. He ground it until it was useless, until it couldn't open anything, because he was afraid of what was behind the door. "Stop grinding the key," he told himself. "Use it." Rose squeezed his hand. "Leonard," she said softly, "do not choose for us, and do not choose for Cain. Choose like the person you want to be when you wake up tomorrow." "When I wake up." "Not if. When." Leonard opened his eyes. The tremor in his hands was gone. The cold fear in his gut was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a mechanic looking at a broken engine and realizing the manual was wrong. "Give me the core," Leonard said to Helen. Helen hesitated, then placed the heavy sphere in his hands. Leonard walked to the altar. Cain smiled, a look of triumphant ecstasy spreading across his face. "Yes," Cain breathed, "the ultimate sacrifice, the purity of the dawn." Leonard held the core over the socket. The red light intensified, eager to drink his life. But Leonard did not lie down on the altar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his multi-tool. He flipped out the laser calibrator. "What are you doing?" Cain asked, his smile faltering. "You said this station runs on a contract," Leonard said, his voice flat and professional. "A trade. Life for light." "Yes," Cain said. "Blood for the seal." "That is a bad trade," Leonard said. "Inefficient. Sustainable systems do not consume their own maintenance crew." Leonard slammed the core into the socket. Clang. The station groaned. The red light flared, reaching for Leonard's heart. Cain laughed. "It is too late, it takes the tithe." "Rose," Leonard shouted. "Now, the night vow, open the channel." Rose didn't ask questions. She slammed her hand against Leonard's back, pouring her energy into him. The connection between them, the bond of the fangs, flared wide open. Leonard didn't let the altar drain him. Instead, he used the connection to push back. He grabbed the edges of the obsidian altar, The mark on his chest burned through his shirt blindingly bright. Station X. Leonard roared, his voice amplified by the facility's intercom. Authorization Sealbearer Leonard, code 001. The red light flickered. The station paused. I am revoking the old covenant, Leonard shouted. Kane stepped forward, horrified. You cannot. It is written in stone. I am the stone, Leonard yelled. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The mark connected him to every bolt, every beam, every circuit of the asteroid. He was the station. Delete protocol tithe, Leonard commanded. Delete protocol bloodlock. The red light in the socket turned a confused purple. The station was fighting him. It demanded a price. It knew only one currency. Price required. The voice of the station boomed in Leonard's skull. Input source. Source is... Leonard gritted his teeth, the strain nearly buckling his knees. Source is volition. He looked at Kane. The tithe of breath is cancelled, Leonard declared. New protocol, the covenant of shared light. Energy is not taken, it is given. That is impossible, Kane shrieked. People are selfish. They will not give unless forced. The light will die. Leonard looked at the core. He poured his own will into it, not his death, but his stubborn, grinding refusal to quit. I am betting on them, Leonard growled. I am betting that if you stop stealing from them, they will keep the lights on themselves. He twisted the core in the socket. It locked with a sound like a thunderclap. Covenant rewritten. The red light vanished. A pulse of pure golden white energy exploded from the altar. It passed through Leonard, through Rose, through the walls of the station. It shot up into the sky, hitting the tear in the atmosphere. The darkness didn't vanish. It didn't burn away. Instead, the golden light wove into it, turning the terrifying void black into a deep, rich twilight, indigo, studded with stable stars. The screaming of the rift stopped. The silence of peace descended. In the sun court below, and in the sanctum above, the tithe machines powered down. The draining stopped, but the lights didn't go out. The sun relic in Brinegate and the main reactor of Station X began to glow with a new light. It wasn't the harsh, blinding glare of the Synod. It was a warm amber glow, soft, enduring. Kane stared at his staff. The crystal at the tip had gone dark. What have you done? Kane whispered. You broke the monopoly. I fixed the wiring, Leonard said, leaning heavily against the altar. He was alive. His heart was beating. The light doesn't belong to you anymore, Gideon. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it. Kane's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He dropped his staff. He pulled a serrated dagger from his robes, a ceremonial blade meant for executions. If I cannot control the light, Kane hissed, I will kill the one who freed it. He lunged at Leonard. Leonard was exhausted. He couldn't lift his wrench. But he didn't have to. A shadow moved. Fast. Faster than I thought. Shing. Margaret stood between Leonard and Kane. She caught the dagger blade with her bare hand. She didn't flinch as the metal cut her skin. That is enough, Margaret said. Her voice was ice. Helen appeared on Kane's other side, her claws resting gently against his jugular. You move, Helen whispered, and I will decorate this room with your arteries. Kane froze. He looked at the three women, the monsters. You are abominations, Kane spat. The people will see you. They will see what you are. They will hunt you down. Let them look, Rose said, stepping up to stand beside Leonard. Below them, on the lower levels of the station, the citizens of Brinegate were waking up from their trance. They looked up. Through the transparent walls of the sanctum, they could see everything. They saw the high prelate with a knife. They saw the three vampiresses standing guard over the exhausted mechanic. They saw who was holding the weapon and who was holding the shield. Kane realized it too. The narrative he had built for 20 years, the narrative of the Holy Synod, protecting the sheep from the wolves, crumbled in a single image. It is over, Gideon, Leonard said. Go home." Kane looked at the citizens below. He saw the anger in their eyes. He saw the realization dawning. He dropped the dagger. It clattered on the stone floor. "You have doomed us to chaos," Kane whispered. "Without order, without the tithe, they will starve in the dark." "No," Leonard said. He pointed to the viewport. Down in Brinegate, a single light flickered on in a window. Then another. Then another. People were manually lighting lanterns. They were starting generators. They were firing up the old heating coils. Without the Synod draining their energy, they had enough strength to make their own light. "They look fine to me," Leonard said. The aftermath was not a parade. It was a negotiation. With Kane's authority shattered, the Dawn Synod fractured. The hardliners fled to the upper spires, while the moderates, led by people like Brother Ansel, stayed to help transition the city. There were no executions. Leonard refused to allow them. "We are not them," he told Helen, who was sharpening her claws with intent. "We build. We do not purge." Station X remained open, but changed. It became exactly what it was meant to be, a way station. A bridge between the void and the islands. Leonard spent the next 3 months in the core room, recalibrating the output. He wasn't alone. Margaret managed the logistics, organizing the flow of supplies, and negotiating treaties with the council. Helen became the head of security, a job she performed with terrifying efficiency and a disturbing amount of glee. And Rose became the diplomat. She walked among the people of Brinegate. At first they were terrified. They crossed the street when she passed. But then the winter storms came. The heating grid in the lower district failed. Rose didn't give a speech. She didn't demand a tithe. She simply went to the district plaza, sat by the frozen fountain, and pushed. She used her resonance as a warden to amplify the ambient heat of the sun relic, channeling it into the homes of the poor. She sat there for 3 days, shivering, taking the cold into herself so the children wouldn't freeze. When the storm broke, the people didn't call her a monster. They brought her blankets. They brought her hot soup. The prejudice didn't vanish overnight. There were still whispers. There were still people who spat when the vampiresses walked by. But the shame was shifting. It was no longer shameful to be too old. It was shameful to be the one holding the stone. 6 months later. The night was quiet. True night, but not the terrifying, devouring dark of the rift. It was a gentle, starlit darkness that rested over Brinegate like a cool blanket. Leonard sat on the balcony of his new quarters in the station, which ironically looked exactly like his old workshop, just with a better view. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. Leonard got up. His legs still ached when the pressure changed, and the mark on his chest still glowed faintly when he was tired, a permanent reminder of the contract he carried. He poured the water. But he didn't reach for the bitter root. He reached for a tin of dried sunberries and sweet leaf, a luxury blend. He carried 2 mugs out to the balcony. Rose was there. She was leaning against the railing, watching the lights of the harbor below. She wore a new dress, not lace but practical wool, dyed a deep midnight blue. "It is peaceful," Rose said without turning. "It is quiet," Leonard corrected, handing her a mug. "There is a difference." Rose took the tea. She inhaled the steam. "Sweet," she noted, looking at him with a smile. "You are spoiling yourself, seal-bearer." "I am retired," Leonard said, sitting down on the bench. "Officially. Margaret is running the council meetings now. I just fixed the plumbing." "You rewrite the laws of physics on Tuesdays," Rose teased, sitting down next to him. "Only on Tuesdays," Leonard grunted. There was a rustle of fabric. Rose shifted. With the familiarity of a habit formed over 100 dangerous nights, she curled up on the bench, resting her head on his chest. Leonard stiffened for a second, then relaxed. He put his arm around her, pulling his heavy coat over her shoulders. "You are warm," Rose murmured, closing her eyes. "I am adequate," Leonard said. From the shadows of the doorway, 2 pairs of eyes watched them. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. Helen was perched on the railing above, cleaning a speck of dust from her boot. "Look at them," Helen whispered. "Disgustingly domestic. If he starts knitting, I am leaving." "He earned the quiet," Margaret said softly. "We all did." "Do you think it will last?" Helen asked, looking out at the stars. "The peace, the covenant." Margaret looked at Leonard and Rose. She saw the mechanic who refused to be a weapon, and the warden who refused to be a monster. "Nothing lasts forever, Helen," Margaret said. "That is why we have to maintain it. Every day. Like a machine." "Like a lock," Helen added, grinning. "Like a home," Margaret corrected. On the bench, Leonard took a sip of his tea. It was sweet. It tasted like berries in sunlight. He looked down at Rose. She was asleep, her breathing slow and steady, syncing perfectly with his own heart. He looked at his hand. The tremor was gone. He reached into his pocket. The broken key was gone. He had melted it down last week to make a new hinge for the garden gate. "Are you awake?" Leonard whispered. Rose hummed against his ribs. "Good," Leonard said. "Because tomorrow I need you to help me fix the heating coil in Sector 4. And then maybe we can go down to the market." "Without the veils." Rose smiled, her fangs, glinting in the starlight. Not sharp, not threatening, just part of the smile. "I would like that," she whispered. "But for now, just breathe, Leonard." Leonard took a breath. He filled his lungs with the cool, clean air of the night he had saved. "I am breathing," Leonard said. And for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel like he was holding his breath, waiting for the end of the world. He was just waiting for the morning. And he knew with absolute certainty that the sun would rise. Not because they paid for it, but because they shared it. Leonard closed his eyes, held the woman he loved, and let the night keep watch.